going to start again now for the next bit. One of the things we talked about last week was the difference between the perfect will of God and the permitted will of God. And in a sense, we've referred to it again already, simply because of this statement of Jesus when he said, "From the beginning it was not so, but because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to put away your wives." In other words, Jesus is saying quite categorically that the perfect will of God would be that you do not put away your wives, that there is forgiveness, that there is reconciliation. But because of the hardness of heart, God, now I know we have to be careful with this kind of language, God has accommodated himself to the hardness of men's heart in the law he gave to them. So you have the perfect will of God and the permitted will of God. And I mentioned last week, or last time we were together, that I remember hearing Mr. North once in his preaching just made this comment that God only ever commends what is perfect, but he sometimes permits what is imperfect. And I think that's a good kind of thing to have in mind with this aspect of things as we go on now into 1 Corinthians. Because you'll see that there's always a kind of I hesitate to use the language of higher and lower way, but there's always a perfect way and there's always a permitted way. So the perfect way is that there would be no divorce, but the permitted way is that there will be a divorce. And the perfect way is, if there is a divorce, that the two people remain unmarried so that ultimately there could be a reconciliation. But the permitted way is that the two people who are separated and divorced go their separate ways and there's never a reconciliation. It's always, in a sense, God's perfect will for there to be reconciliation. It's always God's perfect will that there should be peace. That's to say, harmony. We'll see that word come in, what Paul has to say when he says that God has called us to peace. God's calling is to peace, but sometimes peace is only possible by separating things. That isn't the best way. God's perfect way in peace would be for everything to be joined together in its right patterns and balance. But sometimes the only way you can have peace is to separate things. But the perfect peace would be for everything to be in its right place with no bits missing. Okay, let's see where we go then. All right. So what Paul is saying then is that perfectly there's no divorce, but in the imperfect world there is the possibility of divorce. The divorced person should stay unmarried. That would be the second level of perfection. But in an even deeper level of imperfection, well, that person can go their own way, and I'll explain why I say that in a minute. And he says this little thing here. You see in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 10, he actually says, "Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband." Now, what he's saying here simply is, well, in a sense, he's saying something which is utterly consistent with what Jesus had to say, that there should be no divorce in Matthew chapter 19. From the beginning it was not so. From the beginning it was one man and one woman together for life. That was what it should be from the beginning. So he quotes here because he knows what the Lord's teaching would have been. "Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But, and if, I think the AV says, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife." So that's kind of mutuality in those two things. Now remember that I said that possibly the question that we've had here is not a question is it possible to divorce a man, for a man to divorce his wife, or a woman to divorce her husband. The question may have been, I am married to a non-Christian, wouldn't it be better for me to divorce that person so that I can be free to serve the Lord without distraction? That may have been the question. So if that's the question, this isn't a general answer about divorce in every aspect. It's only an answer about divorce in that particular aspect. And this is why this area of interpretation of the Scripture is really so complicated, and why you get people with such different opinions about it. What they're doing, everyone who comes to a different opinion of this, has actually come to a conclusion that they know what the question is. That's why they speak with authority in saying this. We know what the question is, and this is the answer. I think the question, in the light of what's here, I can see a kind of a pattern here. I can see a pattern of, shall we remain celibate? Shall we stay in marriage? Lots of this chapter has to do with how can I serve God with the least distraction? By being celibate? Well, in that case, should we be celibate? And Paul says no. Okay, well, should I be celibate in my marriage? No. Well, if I've got a wife who isn't absolutely one with me of these things, should I separate from her so that I can join to this one? No. The answer to all these is no. Then he says this, verse 12, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who have a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Now, the believer is not to initiate a divorce on religious grounds, in other words. The believer is not to say, this person can never share with me in my prayers, we can never be yoked together in the service of God, so it would be far better if I was separated from her and joined this one. In fact, there are some fairly major American worldwide global ministries where the man has done just this thing, where he's decided that he could have a far more effective ministry if he had a different woman, because the woman he was with wasn't one with him entirely, so he divorced her and he married another one. And Paul said, no, you're not to do it. That is not what you're to do. Okay. Verse 13, I think we read this. If a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. This is a difficult verse, verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. Well, at the lowest possible interpretation of this, what it's really saying is that a believer in a mixed union, whatever it is, actually can have a sanctifying influence upon that union. That's not to say it makes it perfect in any ways, but it has an effect upon it, which is really quite an amazing thing, because often the Bible's picture is the other way around, that the unbeliever would affect the believer, that sin would affect the holy person. In fact, this is the question that you get in Malachi. If there's a holy man and he's going through somewhere and he touches something which is unholy, what happens? Does the flesh that he's touched become holy, or does the holy man become unholy? And the answer in the Old Testament is categoric. The holy man becomes unholy because of his contact with something which is sinful. But Paul is there's a different spirit in a child of God, and Paul is saying that there's an element at least in which a man or a woman who is a believer, being a believer, has an impact upon that family, and you're not to deprive that family of that impact. Then he says, verse 15, this is the key thing, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in some cases. Now, what does depart mean, and what does not under bondage mean? These are words which are actually well known that they are used in divorce proceedings of the first century. And really, these are all the implications of divorce. And this little thing here, that she's not under bondage, is literally she's not under slavery. In other words, she is free. And remember, that was the last sentence of the old Jewish divorce bill of divorcement, that the woman is free. I interpret this verse as saying this, that if an unbeliever leaves a believer, that the believer who has been abandoned is no longer bound to that man and is free. In other words, that desertion frees the person who has been deserted. There needs to be the technical civil aspect of a divorce, but the person is free. They're not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. What does that mean? Well, like I said before, I think God's perfect peace is when people are reconciled, but sometimes peace can only be achieved by keeping people separate. You can have a union, but that's not communion. You can tie a cat and a dog together by their tails, but that's not communion, and that's certainly not peace. And sometimes it's better to separate things in that way. I won't go into that part now. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to kind of open it. Oh, we've passed our time anyway, but just maybe give an opportunity for one last question. My final question was actually going to be this: what is a Christian marriage? When the Pilgrim Fathers went to America, they actually would not allow their pastors to conduct weddings, because they said to conduct a wedding, that is a civil responsibility. A wedding, they said, is a civil union. It needs to be done by the civil authorities, and they would not give their pastors the power to conduct weddings. Now, as I said last week when we were together, part of the power of the Roman Catholic Church has always been that their priests are the only one who have the power to actually make a man and a woman one flesh in the sight of God. And at the end of their service, they will pronounce this statement: I pronounce you man and wife. That's because they are priestcraft. The priest has the power to do this, and it's an amazing weapon for control. So the Catholic Church is the only people who have the right to bind and to loose. They have the power to bind two people together, and they have the power to dissolve a marriage. Now, there were some Protestant Christians, kind of people who saw that really never had been part of the original revelation. The reason I'm saying this is because the questions that we haven't asked, of course, in this particular aspect now, and I'm going to stop now anyway, is what does the church do about people who have had invalid divorces? What does the church do about this or that? What do the elders do about this? If someone asks you to marry them, does the church have a policy of marrying people who have been divorced? Or is it only the innocent party that they marry? What does it say? Now, there's a way actually you could remove this whole problem in a word, and that would be if the churches stopped doing marriages and just let the civil authorities do it. Now, I'm not advocating it. I'm just simply saying that actually it would save the big issues really. Or what do we do after that? And you get churches which have divided over this issue, because half of the church have said, I'm not going to be in the church if he's here because he's living in adultery, because he's married to this woman and he was divorced from the other one. I know there are still pastoral disciplinary decisions that have to be made by elders and that the whole church is well together. But what I'm saying is, I think we have really given ourselves a kind of a rod to beat our own backs with the way in which Christian churches have assumed that they have the right to marry people, and assumed that they have the right to say, because I have done this, God has joined them together, let no man put them asunder. That's a radical kind of suggestion. But I'll stop now, so we'll switch that off. And if you've got any questions or things you want to throw